Okay. Subcommittee will come to order. Should probably close the doors in the back. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations provided in the rules. We're delighted to have Assistant Secretary Stillwell here, a genuine Senate-confirmed, permanent, well, as permanent as things go in this town, Assistant Secretary for East Asia. I think that's a first in the last 2.5 years. And we also have Acting Assistant Administrator Steele, who's been with us before and continues to be in an acting capacity. I used to think that most of the actors in this country lived in my district. Apparently now we have just as many actors living, or actings living, here in the Washington, D.C. area. They're with us today to discuss U.S. policy toward East Asia, including that in the State Department and the USAID and their respective budgets. With all that's going on in the region, we could probably do, a series of 5-hour hearings. We will abstain from that. I know that I believe elsewhere in the Capitol there's a 3 or 4 hour hearing of a non-official organization just on what's going on in Hong Kong. Speaking of Hong Kong, this has captivated the world's attention. This began in response to a law that would have allowed people in Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China. The protests have expanded into a more general demonstration against Hong Kong's shrinking autonomy. The number of people participating in the demonstrations is truly astounding. You had 2 million people participate in one protest, that being 1/4 of Hong Kong's population. Congress has taken notice. I've introduced a resolution with Ms. Wagner and Mr. Yoho, Mr. Conley, co-sponsored also by Mr. Curtis, that expresses our support and the fact that the American people stand by the people of Hong Kong. Our colleague Chris Smith has introduced the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which many members of this subcommittee, including myself, have co-sponsored. And James McGovern has introduced a bill that would restrict U.S. firms' ability to sell certain non-lethal weapons to the police in Hong Kong. And I and several members of this subcommittee have co-sponsored that bill as well. While Hong Kong has been the focus of world attention, it may not even be the most significant human rights violation in China. That may be what is happening and has continued to happen to the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang province. One administration official has said that 3 million Uyghurs and other minorities are in what that official called concentration camps. And yet, despite multiple appeals from both parties in Congress, the current administration has not sanctioned a single Chinese official for their role in this atrocity. Thankfully, Congress is beginning to act. The Senate recently passed a bill focused on Uyghur human rights, and Congressman Smith and I have bills that we introduced quite some time ago and that I expect the full committee will move on soon. Moving south, we see the Rohingya, another Muslim minority, under siege. Given the fact that both with regard to the Uyghurs and the Rohingya, the United States has done far more than just about any country in the world, save only Bangladesh that has opened its borders to the Rohingya refugees. It is astounding that there are some in the Muslim world that try to paint the United States as anti-Muslim. We are, after all, the country that bombed Belgrade to save the people of Kosovo and Bosnia at various times. The Burmese military's atrocities against the Rohingya have led nearly 1 million people to flee to Bangladesh. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya are displaced internally in Burma. which I know their government calls Myanmar and our State Department calls Burma. Chairman Engel has been a leader on this issue and has introduced the Burma Act, which the full committee passed in July. I think more pressure needs to be brought to bear on the Burmese government and the military in order to create conditions so that the Rohingya can return in safety and with citizenship documents. That is why I join with Ms. Wagner in introducing this week a bill that would revoke Burma's GSA preference, its duty-free exports to the United States, so long as the Rohingya are wrongfully exiled and subject to mistreatment. These trade privileges will be restored only when the President certifies that Burma has created conditions for the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of the Rohingya, including citizenship documents. And I have gone so far, and I did this to drive home a point, that if Burma cannot provide safety for the people of North Rakhine State, and moreover, if its military and officials engage in ethnic cleansing, then perhaps that area should become independent or be transferred to sovereignty of Bangladesh. This is not because I see a desire to change international borders, but I will point out that the United States has supported the change of international borders almost never, but once, in order to prevent genocide and ethnic cleansing, and that was the creation of South Sudan. So while we support, in general, the territorial integrity of all countries, when a country engages in mass atrocities against a part of its population, that can change. The United States needs a more balanced trade relationship with the countries in the region. I actually commend President Trump for recognizing we have the problem, but we have not achieved a solution. Our trade deficit last year with China was $419 billion, 21% increase over the last year of the Obama administration, and we should not forget our trade deficits with Japan, $67 billion, South Korea, $17 billion, Vietnam, $39 billion, and Taiwan, $15 billion. My script says I'm almost out of time. That's very charitable, but there are a couple other issues I should mention. One is the escalating dispute between Japan and South Korea, which impairs our ability to defend the region, and I will be asking our witness whether we should be seeking to mediate that dispute. We have President Duterte's massive human rights abuses in the Philippines, including the imprisonment of Senator De Lima, Cambodia's prosecution of 2 Radio-Free Asia journalists, and a verdict is expected soon. The State Department certified that Thailand had a civilian and democratic government. That's a questionable designation given the highly questionable election that they've just concluded. And finally, Vietnam has imprisoned a man from California, Michael Nguyen, and this subcommittee discussed that case back in July. Michael has been detained since 2018. With that, I will turn it over to our ranking member for his remarks, unless the ranking member of the full committee is on. We'll go to the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you being here, Ms. Stilwell, Assistant Secretary, and Ms. Steele, the Acting Assistant Secretary, for the Bureau that you're in, because you're doing a great job. I've followed you over the last few years, and I appreciate you standing up and doing what you're doing, so thank you. Thank you, Chairman Sherman, for calling this hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the fiscal year 2020 Foreign Assistance Budget request for the East Asia Pacific region. I'd also like to thank our esteemed witnesses, David Stilwell, Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, and Ms. Gloria Steele. Nations in this region play an important role in the international community, and it is imperative that the United States adequately invest in the security and prosperity of this region. Combating rising global threats to democracy, including growing trends of authoritarianism, will be one of our greatest challenges in the coming decade. To combat growing threats to security, economic prosperity, and stability in the East Asia-Pacific region, Congress must ensure that both the State Department and USAID are adequately equipped to counter these challenges. Under the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, and I appreciate you mentioning that in a positive light, both departments have prioritized our strong relationships in the region and invested in the well-being of these countries and their people. Beyond dollar value investments, the U.S. government has also advanced American values like good governance, accountability, transparency, and these things must continue. These ventures must be coordinated and efficient to counter aggressive actors in the region. To this extent, I look forward to the rollout of our new U.S. Development Finance Corporation in a few weeks, in October. This new tool will encourage a public-private investment partnership to bring needed infrastructure and development to all corners of the world, including the East Asia-Pacific region. Through coordination with USAID and the State Department, the Development Finance Corporation will provide our allies with transparent and trusted investments to counter China's debt trap diplomacy. America's new Development Finance Corporation will be mutually beneficial to the recipient countries and to the U.S., but also to the citizens and the economies of those countries. Our partners in the East Asia Pacific must look towards the U.S. for development assistance that will not lead them economically and politically beholden to a country that has no regard for the well-being of the other nation. Over the coming years, the State Department and USAID must prioritize partners like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Philippines, the Indonesians, the ASEAN bloc of nations who are susceptible to aggressive campaigns in the region. We must also increase our strategic presence in the Pacific Islands, an area that is often overlooked but of great importance to the security of the United States and the region and the world. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today as we discuss how USAID and the State Department have advanced U.S. priorities in the East Asia Pacific and hear from you your recommendations. With that, I yield back, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania does not have an opening statement, and I will recognize the gentleman from Texas for whatever opening statement he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Assistant Secretary and Ms. Steele. I think I speak for many of us here that your area of responsibility with China is at the forefront of our strategic, long-range diplomatic, security, and economic considerations here in Washington. I want to say this morning I had the honor to hold a press conference with the Speaker and members of both parties in support of the Human Rights and Democracy Act in support of Hong Kong. And I think that will be heard around the globe, especially in China and in Hong Kong. As a Pacific power, the United States has always been tightly linked to the other Indo-Pacific nations. But under General Secretary Xi Jinping's leadership, the Chinese Communist Party is challenging American leadership like never before, stepping up territorial aggression, I should say, against our partners and allies, openly engaging in unfair and illegal business practices and exporting authoritarian ideology across the globe. Simply put, China is our strategic adversary. And I'm glad we are no longer asleep at the switch any longer. It is my hope the administration and Congress can work together in a bipartisan way with more urgency. We must implement the Indo-Pacific strategy across every branch of government to stop Communist China from achieving global dominance. And make no mistake, that is their goal. Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative and associated debt traps has set the stage for economic and diplomatic coercion and military expansion. As part of this program, China has tried to build military bases in the South Pacific to cut us off from Australia and New Zealand. In Africa, they have a military base next to ours in Djibouti. China has even major inroads into Western Hemisphere, controlling both sides of Teddy Roosevelt's Panama Canal. On the technology side, our intelligence community has warned us that China's victory in the 5G battle would mean CCP control over the bulk of global data, an unacceptable risk to Americans' personal privacy and our security. According to Made in China 2025, they plan to dominate vital emerging technologies like AI, semiconductors, and quantum computing. Just imagine if China wins the quantum race and encryption will be almost meaningless. That is a Sputnik moment we cannot allow to happen. Xi Jinping's desire for power and control goes beyond his territorial and global ambitions. Today, the Communist Party of China is putting the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in concentration camps, criminalizing faith and culture, and denying basic guaranteed freedoms to the people of Hong Kong. As important as it is to call them out for these crimes that make the headlines, we must also look deeper at their own other nefarious and, I would say, deceptive efforts. Chinese companies with non-transparent corporate structures, questionable records, and links to the Communist Chinese Party benefit from billions of dollars in U.S. capital, including our hard-earned pension dollars, even though they're not subject to the same basic oversight or accounting standards as American companies. Imagine our own thrift savings plans here in the federal government somehow assisting the Chinese Communist Party. Their aggressive infiltration targets have attacked Americans. They have, for example, a comprehensive national effort called the 1,000 Talents Program that I have tried to call attention to, whose goal is to facilitate the legal and illicit transfer of U.S. technology, intellectual property, and know-how from our businesses and universities to China. In fact, MD Anderson in my district, or in my state, I should say, have 3 indictments of potential Chinese espionage cases, immunotherapy being a breakthrough in cancer research. And they also interfere with our democracy. And I'd like to go back when I was a young DOJ prosecutor. I became intimately familiar with this effort in the late 1990s to influence our political process when I participated in the Campaign Finance Task Force and was a lead prosecutor in the Johnny Chung case. That case, it led us to the Director of Chinese Intelligence, who worked with China Aerospace and the PLA military intelligence apparatus to funnel almost $400,000 to the Clinton campaign in order to get privileged access to influence U.S. policy towards China. So influencing our elections is nothing new. And we must remind China's leaders that any influence in our 2020 elections will not be tolerated. Finally, and saddest of all, they are facilitating the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans every year by knowingly manufacturing and shipping fentanyl and its precursors. Mr. Secretary, you have a vital and challenging job. And what a great foreign policy for China. And they look back at the opium wars. They can poison Americans and make money off it. I'm sure you were heartened recently as thousands of brave democratic activists assembled outside the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong, waving American flags, singing our national anthem, and demanding that the United States stand up to the Chinese Communist Party. And just today, I was honored to meet with them. They are a true inspiration for democracy over tyranny. So I thank you for being here today. And Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, and I would comment that there are bills to require us to start looking at the packages coming in from China to get the fentanyl, and that I'm working on legislation, look forward to working with you on it, to encourage or at least hold harmless those countries that have debts to China that are part of a debt trap and simply choose not to pay. That shouldn't hurt their credit rating. With that, the gentleman from Hawaii is allowed, without objection, can participate in this hearing. He informs me he does not have an opening statement, and I do not know who else wishes to be recognized for an opening statement.
Just for a brief second.
Sure, I'll recognize the gentlelady from Missouri.
I thank the chairman very, very much for hosting this hearing, very important, and to our witnesses, not just for your time, but for your service to our country. I want to just make a statement here of strength and policy, supporting and associating myself with the ranking member's comments along with our chairman's. The Indo-Pacific is home to some of the world's largest populations, democracies, and fastest-growing economies. The United States must continue to invest in this dynamic region in order to secure a future in which rule of law, free and fair trade, and strong democratic institutions underpin relations among Indo-Pacific states. With that, I will yield back, as promised, quickly, and I look forward to questions.
Does the gentlelady from Virginia have an opening statement? And so now it's time to introduce witnesses. We have with us the newly confirmed new Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He is a former Brigadier General and was Asia Advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I look forward to hearing his testimony. Let's hear the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Thanks, sir. Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Yoho, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to testify regarding the President's fiscal year 2020 budget request for East Asia and the Pacific. I thank the subcommittee for its leadership in supporting engagement with the Asia-Pacific region. Pleased to be joined by Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID, Asia Bureau Gloria Steele, who represents one of our primary USG partners in implementing this strategy. This region is home to a host of the administration's top foreign policy challenges, addressing the Chinese government's pursuit of a repressive alternative vision of regional order that would trample the shared norms and democratic principles that have provided peace and prosperity for billions of people. Also need to address unfair and non-reciprocal trade relations, need to ensure continued U.S. access to strategic sea and airspace that is vital to our economic and geographic security, and building international commitment to address the nuclear and missile threat from North Korea. Simply put, what the United States does in this region will have a significant impact on whether the current free and open international order endures or is replaced by a new type of governance that favors might makes right, revisionism, and repression. Our work here truly matters. In support of the administration's Indo-Pacific Strategy Implementation Plan, the President's FY2020 request includes a diplomatic engagement budget of $336 million and a foreign assistance budget of $760 million for the EAP Bureau. Consistent with the administration's approach to burden sharing, we are coordinating with our partners and allies, treaty allies, Japan, Australia, and ROK, each with their own Indo-Pacific strategies, are leaders in this regard. In Southeast Asia, there is a great potential to further expand cooperation with treaty allies, Thailand and the Philippines, and with important partners such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore. More broadly, the administration is committed to our efforts throughout the region, including our engagement with ASEAN, the ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, Pacific Islands Forum, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. Our budget request sees significant growth in assistance for the Pacific Islands. Ramping up U.S. assistance in coordination with other partners will demonstrate our solid and growing commitment to the Pacific, with an emphasis on helping them defend their own interests. On 5 August, Secretary Pompeo announced our intent to begin negotiations on certain provisions of the compacts with the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. In the economic sphere, EAP programs in this request will reinforce the market-based economic systems, private sector finance, and open investment environments that have driven the region's economic success. The Infrastructure, Transaction, and Assistance Network is a whole-of-government initiative to mobilize USG resources and private sector investment to develop high-quality and financially sustainable infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region. It will work closely with the soon-to-be-launched U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, as mentioned, and other government agencies. We address energy infrastructure through Asia Edge. This is a whole-of-government effort to strengthen energy security and ensure energy access across the Indo-Pacific. The United States provides technical assistance to approve partner countries' policy, legal, and regulatory, as well as commercial environments and energy-related procurement processes to attract qualified investment. It also works with partners to develop national and regional energy markets, uses development finance to encourage the deployment of private capital, and helps countries develop smart grids and modern energy infrastructure. On the cyber front, the Digital Connectivity and Cyber Security Partnership promotes access to an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet in developing countries, with an initial focus on the Indo-Pacific region. This initiative establishes public-private partnerships to build digital infrastructure expand opportunities for U.S. exports, and deploy technical assistance to support projects ranging from crafting sector regulations to improving cyber incident response capabilities. As the Indo-Pacific becomes more contested and dynamic, we have to work harder to ensure peace and security. We are working with partners to strengthen maritime security and domain awareness, cybersecurity, humanitarian assistance, and disaster response, as well as to counter transnational crime. Eliminating the threat to the United States and our allies posed by North Korea's illicit nuclear and ballistic missile programs is a top diplomatic priority. We are expending enormous efforts to increase trilateral security cooperation with Japan and South Korea. On the South China Sea, we have stated our deep concern for China's recent provocative actions against oil and gas activities in the region. These actions undermine peace and stability in the region and call into question Beijing's commitment to peaceful resolution of maritime disputes. Our focus in governance strengthens the economic pillar of our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Continued prosperity and autonomy are rooted in good governance and transparency. The EAP request supports strong civil society, efforts to counter corruption, judicial sector and legal reform, responsible borrowing, and the honest procurement and contracting practices, among other aims. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, the Department of State is making significant progress toward ensuring that the Indo-Pacific continues to be peaceful, prosperous, and an economically dynamic region. But the challenges, especially those posed by Beijing's revisionist, aggressive, and subversive policies, will not go away anytime soon. We welcome your support for the FY2020 budget request and look forward to working with you and other members of Congress to continue to build on our accomplishments in the region. Thank you for inviting me to testify today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Ms. Steele.
Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Yoho, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm pleased to be here alongside Assistant Secretary Stilwell. The fiscal year 2020 budget request for USAID's development assistance in the Asia-Pacific region is $409 million. This request enables USAID to continue playing a leading role in advancing the President's vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, while at the same time advancing USAID's mission of helping our partner countries achieve progress on their journeys to self-reliance or reach the day when they no longer need foreign assistance from us. The Indo-Pacific region is home to the world's fastest-growing markets and offers unprecedented potential to strengthen U.S. economy while improving lives in Asia. Yet the region's continued growth and the ability of U.S. companies to compete freely and fairly is hindered by deficits in good governance, rule of law, and respect for fundamental freedoms. These conditions are also compromise stability in the region, which is home to majority of the humanity. A free and open region is essential to our own prosperity and security. USAID is proud to be a major contributor to advancing this vision. With taxpayer dollars allocated to us, we are sharply focused on directly countering malign influence that hinder progress toward a free and open Indo-Pacific region. We focus our efforts on three objectives that we see as having the highest potential to generate concrete near-term results, including benefits to U.S. private sector. These objectives are fostering good governance and transparency, as well as strengthening democratic systems, unlocking private sector enterprise-driven economic growth, including by leveling the playing field for legitimate investors who are often constrained by the lack of transparency and corruption in business processes abroad, and improving the management of natural resources, particularly energy, which are important for sustained long-term growth. On good governance, USAID plays a leading role in the U.S. government's Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative to foster sound, just, and responsive governance, strengthen democratic systems, and protect human rights. In the Philippines, for example, where public frustration with slow court system has contributed to tolerance for a harsh anti-drug campaign, USAID introduced an e-court management system in more than 300 trial courts and trained more than 3,000 judicial personnel. These have enabled courts to handle cases more transparently and expeditiously. For example, the average rate of pending cases in the courts that received U.S. assistance has been reduced by over 4%, from 4 years to 2.3 years. A lot more work needs to be done, but there is progress there. On unlocking private enterprise-driven economic growth, we are taking advantage of our on-the-ground long-term presence in our in-country relationships to reform policies and foster transparency and rules-based transactions. For example, we have helped Vietnam to significantly streamline its business processes through policy changes, thereby easing transactions with this country. Through a new trade facilitation program, we will build the capacity of its customs department to comply with global trade norms, reduce time and cost of trade, and increase its capacity to stop transshipment of Chinese goods that are intended to avoid U.S. tariffs. On improving the management of natural resources, USAID supports the implementation of Asia Edge. As part of this initiative, USAID recently launched a partnership with the Asia Development Bank to mobilize $7 billion worth of investments to strengthen the region's energy security and develop markets for U.S. companies. In Indonesia, USAID collaborates with the California Independent System Operator to support the integration of renewable energy into Indonesia's power grids. This has unlocked hundreds of millions in new investments and paved the way for development of Indonesia's first 2 utility-scale wind farms, both led by American firms. With fiscal year 2020 resources, we plan to build upon the successes that we have had to date and scale them up in the rest of East Asia. Our 3 objectives to advance the Indo-Pacific vision go hand in hand with our efforts to develop partner countries' capacity and commitment to drive and finance their own development over the long term. We want to see these countries ultimately move from being aid recipients to partners to fellow donors. This is an example that we derive from South Korea, which used to be a big recipient of foreign assistance. We see this work as fundamental to creating the foundations for a free and Indo-Pacific region. For development to be inclusive and sustainable over generations, we must also prioritize gains in health and education. In Cambodia, we are on track to transition the healthcare system for more than 2.5 million of Cambodia's poorest people to the Cambodian government next year. In Vietnam, just this month, we reached a turning point in the country's higher education reform with the official launch of an undergraduate program in the USAID-supported Fulbright University in Vietnam, the country's first fully independent, not-for-profit university. In closing, the East Asia-Pacific region is a strategically important one for the United States. With this budget request, USAID will continue efforts vital to advancing free and open Indo-Pacific and increasing partner countries' ability to drive and finance their own development. Thank you very much for your support.
Thank you. I'll reserve my questions for later and recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your testimony. You know, this committee, out of your testimonies comes so much information that leads into legislation like the Taiwan Relations Act to educate members, or the Taiwan inviting them back into the World Health Assembly, or we're working on one with a free trade agreement with Taiwan, or the Cambodia Democracy Act that's been passed in the House, and the Champion of American Business Act of Chairman McCall's. And these are all good legislation ideas that come out of your testimony, so I value your input. Secretary Stilwell, you've got a vast amount of experience and knowledge with your service in the Air Force, which we appreciate it, and retired as a Brigadier General. You joined by another one here, different branch. But you know that area very well, and when you look at it strategically, I know you look at things and you can say, if we could do this, if Congress would create this, and again, the BUILD Act came out of meetings like this. We saw a need to fulfill. And so when you look at that, and you too, Ms. Steele, when you look at those areas, where do we need to concentrate, and what can we do better than we've done in the past so that we can move forward to increase those relationships?
Congressman Yoho, that's a question very near and dear to my heart. We know the 3 pillars of the Indo-Pacific strategy are obviously security. We've been doing that a long time. Prosperity, economics, again, that's inherent. Governance, that one is relatively new since it's now challenged. We assumed democracy was the norm. But since you're asking for new thoughts, human capital is a thought, an idea we heard a lot of on this last trip to the region. This idea that American education institutions, American processes, American democracy, a number of things that we do here, science technology education, any number of legal education for rule of law. These are things that we can cheaply export to these regions, and there's a very large thirst for these. We have done things recently to manage the numbers and types of students coming to the U.S., specifically from China. If you look at those numbers, they're actually continue to rise. It's just that we are taking a harder look at who is coming and from what organizations and with what intent. And so if I was to offer one thought, I would look at the, sharing what it is that makes the U.S. great in terms of human capital, and then sharing that with the soon-to-be leaders of these countries. Thank you.
That's good. Ms. Steele?
Thank you very much for asking that question. First of all, I would like to thank you for the support we have received to date. The support for the Indo-Pacific strategy and the journey to self-reliance are very important to us and to the mandate of USAID. We do, like you, want to be able to move countries away from full dependence on us, but we need to build upon their commitment and their capacity. And rather than coming up with new ideas, what I would like to request is that you continue to support the programs that we have right now. For implementing the Indo-Pacific, we are working on improving transparency and governance, strengthening economic systems, and improving management of natural resources. We want to invest in health and education, and we need to continue to be able to do this and to scale up the successes we've reached today.
When you guys talk to these different countries and you've seen firsthand the effects of the Belt Road Initiative, and the reports we get, the things we read, we see that China comes in with their workers, with their material. They build hotels to accommodate their workers. They build restaurants. Do you see them building the local economy using local help, either one of you?
Congressman, in Africa, I mean, that was sort of the beginning, the poster child for this phenomenon. It was apparent that not only did they bring in their own workers, but they brought in a unique management style, which did not really comport with local style. And that I think you would find that not just the U.S., but Western companies, Japan, Korea, allies, partners, EU, do take advantage of local talent, are more accepting of diversity and the rest. And so you make a great point that they have sort of occasionally worn out their welcome.
Well, go ahead, Ms. Steele.
I have not seen that they have developed the economy nor the capacity of the people in the countries they've worked in. And I think that many of the countries are beginning to realize this. We see this in countries like Sri Lanka and even in the Philippines, which the civil society have tried to keep Duterte from being able to go through with commitments that he has made to China, because he has seen that they have seen that there's very little value added to their own economy and to their own capacity. And that is something that America brings that they all recognize. And we should remember that. And I think we should continue to scale that up and not run away from our responsibility.
And I appreciate you saying that. And that's the thing that we depend on you, because you're the boots on the ground. You're the one there. You're the one there that are going to be developing the local economy. And we need to make sure that we put America's best foot forward as the American Development Finance Corporation comes out. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Now recognized for 5 minutes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Assistant Secretary Stillwell and Ms. Steele as well. My first question has to do with biosecurity, disease, and pandemic. And I was wondering, the World Health Organization estimates that between 2030 and 2050, climate change will lead to 250,000 additional deaths from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, heat stress. In addition, as recently as I believe this week, the UN said that they expect that there could be a large possibility for a pandemic with as many as 80 million people possibly affected, and that would also affect about 5% of the global economy as well. And experts believe that climate change will contribute to new infections that we really haven't heard of before. For example, in Asia, we've seen a surge in the number of dengue fever, which has affected thousands and thousands of new infections. And so my question for you both is, how are you working, how is the administration working with our international partners to make sure that we're thinking about these issues, because they're only an issue when they become an issue, and they're not something that's necessarily top of mind?
Thank you. We are working very closely with the WHO, particularly on the issue of malaria in the countries that we work, particularly in the Mekong River area. We support their efforts to develop capacity alongside the efforts that we are providing in these countries. Fighting this, diseases such as TB, malaria, and the pandemics are a very important part of what we do in East Asia and the Pacific, and we will continue to do that. But the CDC and the WHO are very tight partners to USAID.
Thank you.
Congressman, I could only add that all entities need to be included in these bodies, such as WHO, and the exclusion of some non-state bodies, such as Taiwan, is only to the detriment of all. Since they have much to offer, but they also stand to suffer and become part of the problem if they're not allowed access. And so we just like to encourage their continued participation, not just WHO, but Interpol, ICAO, and all the rest.
That's very, very helpful. And speaking of Taiwan, if you wouldn't mind helping me understand to the degree that you're able, do you worry at all with the upcoming elections and with China if there's any sort of ongoing concern about election interference or otherwise? And can you comment on that to the degree that you're able?
Thank you for that. Given the past, given the history, given our own elections, and certainly Taiwan's elections in the past, that is always a concern. Interference comes in a number of ways, and some just are part of the, the environment. Everybody, that's the beauty of elections, is they're open, but it's also one of the risks. But there are those things that we can do something about, and certainly cyber intrusion and actual manipulation of votes is certainly of great concern. And I do believe that there are things we can do, not only to protect our own democracy, but to help others and protect theirs.
And maybe what I would ask is if we might, offline of this conversation, if you feel uncomfortable with exact details, provide examples of what we can be doing to be more helpful in that area.
I would be happy to do that.
That would be great. And with my last minute and 23 seconds, if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Stillwell, what is your understanding of the China-Cambodia agreements over the Ream port, and what will happen if the PL Navy has permanent access to that port?
Well, thank you for that question. I do believe that it represents a larger strategy to push not just PLA, but Chinese presence throughout the region, especially along its critical sea lines of communication and other things. And so, as you mentioned, there's been lots of reports in the news and elsewhere of the intent to develop a port, and in this case, a naval facility on Cambodia territory. Contravening Cambodia's own law about allowing foreign forces to be based in their own territory. We've noted that both Thailand and Vietnam have taken issue with this and have voiced their concerns. We support them in that concern, and it would simply ask, as we ask in many of these things, for some transparency, for visibility on both intent, and help us understand what they're. Because the words say there's nothing to see here; it's just development. But unfortunately, as we've seen in Djibouti and Pakistan and other places, there's more to it. And so we will continue to press on that.
Thank you, and I yield back. I appreciate it.
Now recognize the gentlelady from Missouri.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our witnesses for their testimony. The administration has requested a sharply increased funding for the Pacific Islands. While many Pacific Island nations cooperate closely with the United States, just 2 days ago, the Solomon Islands announced it would break with Taiwan and instead recognize China. China coerced the Solomon Islands to make this decision before the communist government's 70th anniversary on October 1. Assistant Secretary Stillwell, have you considered traveling to Taipei in accordance with the Taiwan Travel Act to demonstrate America's support for Taiwan in the wake of this demoralizing event?
Congresswoman, there's 3 parts to that question, and I will try to address all 3. The first part is concern about what's happening in the Pacific. If you look at the Federated States of Micronesia, for instance, it covers a piece of territory the size of the United States. It's massive. The actual land isn't that great, but the water is. And the EEZs and the resources those represent are of great interest not only to those countries, but to us as well, because they carry strategic significance. And so I accompanied the Secretary recently, early August, on a trip to Micronesia, first time ever for a Secretary of State to go there. And we had some great exchange with both Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands presidents on ways that we can, one, resume the compact, at least maintain our position there, as the compact is coming up for renewal, and then sending a message to the rest of the region that the U.S. is not absent, that we are interested, and then we will be there to help. On the issue of the Solomon Islands itself, we're concerned in that as you describe, intentional shifting over is really aimed at Taiwan and in shrinking Taiwan's diplomatic space, which we would, again, remind all players of the intent of the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 communiques and all other agreements is to settle this problem between the PRC and Taiwan in a diplomatic and through dialogue and not through pressure, coercion, and the rest. Please remind me the last part.
Well, I just want to encourage you to consider traveling to Taipei, especially given that multiple countries have recently severed their ties with Chinese due to pressure.
Congressman, if you point to recent history, I think you'll find very positive movement on both sides, so of Taiwan leaders to the U.S. and vice versa. Certainly want to remain inside our own commitments to the PRC to demonstrate what rule of law looks like and abiding by commitments, because that's the issue we have right now, is signing up to something and then not following through or ignoring it. We'd like to demonstrate proper behavior, but I do believe that there is still room to explore, and the Taiwan Travel Act does give us that.
It does give us that, and I want to make sure that Taipei's sovereignty does not erode further. And have you got anything else to add about some of the actions that the U.S. government may be able to take to ensure that?
We are exercising the latitude given Taiwan Travel Act, and I'll be happy afterward to get back to you.
I appreciate it. Ms. Steele, can you explain the rationale for the increase in the Pacific Island funding? We've had a little bit of a preview of that and its strategic importance, but will any funding be directed to the Solomon Islands, which has just undermined U.S. strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific?
We are reassessing our assistance to the Solomon Islands at this point. But we are working in other countries, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, the Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and all the other countries. They are strategically important to us, both from a security perspective and an economic perspective.
I appreciate it. And I know I only have a minute left here, but the chairman did talk about Hong Kong, so I'm just going to say that we're all obviously deeply concerned regarding China's attempts to use influence operations to silence critics of its harsh response to the Hong Kong protesters, who continue to fight heroically the erosion of their autonomy under the heavy-handed Xi administration. Ms. Steele, how is the United States working to amplify voices supporting Hong Kong's autonomy?
I would like to yield that question.
Can you yield to the Assistant Secretary, please?
Well, I would first like to compliment the Congress on meetings today with Joshua Wong, and that doesn't violate anything. He's free to meet with, he's a private citizen, he can meet with who he chooses, and Congress can meet with who they like. And again, those are things that are, again, very positive demonstrations of support for the activity there. And I think has had the proper deterrent effect, because we have not seen the things that we were most concerned about was a 1989 reenactment.
Right.
So I would say that U.S. policy, although sometimes intangible, sometimes squishy, that is definitely effective. It just sometimes you have to take time, be patient, and watch. But as far as deterring negative action, and I hope it continues to prevent any ill-advised activity.
My time has expired. I'm sure others will ask the question. I appreciate the cooperation of the chairman on our recent legislation. I appreciate that very, very much, and I will yield back.
Yes, I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Secretary, you talk about us making commitments to China with regard to a one China policy. Was that pursuant to a ratified treaty or just a presidential commitment?
Mr. Chairman, are we discussing 1972, 1979 and beyond, or?
Yes, I mean, we're talking about the commitment made at least by the executive branch and perhaps by us. I'm just asking a question. Is there a ratified treaty under which we agree to, for example, not have you visit Taipei?
On the U.S. side, we have the Taiwan Relations Act, which encapsulates and captures the discussions and the agreements between 1972 and 79. Those, as far as bilateral agreements, are captured in the 3 communiques.
Well, the communiques, that's just a statement by a president of the United States, no more significant legally than the JCPOA. So that can be swept aside. But there is the one enactment by Congress.
And I think they complement each other quite well.
I feel that if you cannot trust a regime with a bone saw, you shouldn't trust them with nuclear weapons. So I'm going to focus on the efforts by Saudi Arabia to develop a nuclear energy/nuclear weapons program. This might very well involve South Korea, which is one of the 5 countries bidding on 2 nuclear reactors in Saudi Arabia. The nuclear cooperation agreement South Korea signed with Saudi Arabia allows the kingdom to enrich up to 20%, far more than is necessary for the production of power, and 90% of the way to fissile material for a nuclear bomb. Now, KEPCO, the South Korean nuclear firm bidding on the contract, uses U.S. technology. Is it the State Department position that KEPCO would not be allowed to sell Saudi Arabia nuclear reactors unless the United States signs a nuclear cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia?
Mr. Chairman, I have not been in this job long enough to research all of those. I knew there's a 1, 2, 3 agreement process that we need to look into, and as far as South Korea's business.
I tell you what, respond for the record.
Certainly.
But let me ask you to do one thing and make it plain. America's died by the tens of thousands to defend South Korea. We stand ready to defend them. If they are undermining the security and exposing millions of people to death by Saudi Arabia nuclear weapons just for a buck, that is inconsistent with everything we've done with regard to defending and continuing to defend South Korea, and is a dishonoring of the death of every American who fought in the Korean War, not to mention, as I say, exposing many millions of people to the risk of nuclear death. In my opening statement, I mentioned that not only do we have a huge trade deficit with China, but also $67 billion with Japan, $17 billion with South Korea, $39 billion with Vietnam, $15 billion with Taiwan. Perhaps under the China Relations Act, you could go to Taiwan only for the purpose of eliminating that trade deficit. What is the State Department? I see other foreign ministries from all over the world really pushing hard to help their workers. What is the State Department going to do to close these gaps?
Mr. Chairman, thanks for that question. I've been in this job 2.5 months. I've been in the region 3 times already, and you know that's not a short trip. I've been as far as Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Brunei, Singapore, Japan, Korea, all the runs you mentioned, some twice. And you know, the business of America is business, and we've carried that message as well. And that, you know, we hear back without asking the concerns and the understanding of the President's concerns with trade deficits and getting truly mutually beneficial trade agreements. And so
But
they hear it.
Does Japan feel that if they don't reduce that trade deficit, that that's an irritant to U.S.-Japanese relations?
Sir, I believe that's been made eminently clear, and I do think we just finished a free trade agreement with the Koreans. I think we're going to hopefully
Well,
conclude.
that's not a free trade agreement that led to a reduced trade deficit. That's just a free trade agreement that helps Wall Street. Let's continue to focus on Japan and Korea. They have many disputes going back to World War II. What Japan did in the first half of the 20th century was outrageous. The fact that the South Koreans don't seem to be able to reach a final agreement with Japan as to what the recompense should be, or reach a final agreement that turns out not to be final, has got to be frustrating to the Japanese. While you were there, you said you did not plan to mediate or engage, given how critical it is that Japan and China work together, especially go back to implementing their trilateral intelligence sharing agreement. What can we do to make sure that the antipathy of the first half of the 20th century does not lead to military and insecurity in the first half of the 21st century?
Mr. Chairman, I did say that I did not intend to arbitrate, and I do believe that's the right way to go on this, but I did not say I was not engaged. I was I burned up a lot of time on phones in meetings. The Secretary has met trilaterally with both Japan and Korea as a group 8 times, the President twice. I can't tell you how many times I've met both bilaterally and trilaterally to address.
But you realize how difficult it is to explain to American taxpayers why they should spend more to have a bigger commitment to Northeast Asia, because we have to deal with the inefficiencies of the fact that the Japanese and South Koreans are focused on the first half of the 20th century, and because they can't go, I don't want to be glib about this, but given a choice between having a naval squadron or having good cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo, I think a lot of military planners would choose the latter. But the former, of course, requires just more money from the American people and more risk to American lives. I believe I've gone over, and will now recognize the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to acknowledge the comments of my colleague, Ms. Wagner, and kind of take up where she left off. The issue of countries breaking diplomatic ties with Taiwan is particularly sensitive to me. I lived in Taiwan in 1979 and experienced their response to the United States. I last week sent a letter to the Secretary of State and Attorney General in relationship to Taiwan's participation in Interpol. I'd like to thank the ranking member and the chairman and 45 of my colleagues who joined me on that letter. In essence, China has aggressively tried to prevent Taiwan from joining international organizations, sometimes as benign as the World Health Organization and Interpol. And these organizations address transnational issues. It seems that when we exclude Taiwan, it really benefits nobody. Why isn't the United States doing more to exert influence and allowing Taiwan into these organizations, even just as an observer, and what can we do?
Congressman, that's obviously an important topic for us, especially given the recent announcement coming out of Solomon Islands. Excuse me. Certainly, we support and have aggressively defended Taiwan's international space to the max extent possible, as well as their participation in international organizations that don't require statehood. I mean, we do mean it. The Taiwan Relations Act does talk about one China policy, and we, again, true to our word, have supported that. But we also understand that there are many international organizations that do require non-state entities, such as Taiwan, to have access to. And World Health Organization is a great example, as well as Chinese attempts recently to prevent them from participating. Interpol is another. And so we certainly understand and support the desire to continue to protect Taiwan's international space so that the disagreement, the concerns between Taiwan and the PRC can be resolved through dialogue peacefully without coercion.
Thank you. I'll conclude with not so much a question as a statement of my sincere interest and support for the residents of Hong Kong, this very delicate situation, and I hope the international community is able to watch this conclude in a way that allows for human rights and for the people to have the rights that they deserve there in Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
Yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from Northern California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up on, some points that the chairman raised a little bit. As the chair of the caucus on Korea, I've traveled multiple times over the last few years, both to the Korean Peninsula, but also to our friends and allies in Japan as well. And, Assistant Secretary Stillwell, maybe if you could just expand. Obviously, pretty concerned about the deterioration of the relationship between two close friends of the United States in the Republic of Korea and Japan. And my 8 years in Congress and on this subcommittee, feels like the relationship is at its low point right now. And just curious how State Department and others are thinking about this, and what role Congress could play in certainly helping push to a better relationship.
Congressman, thank you for that. And I just continue my comment that, as you mentioned, the one thing advantage we have in the region, in the world, is the like-minded allies and partners, and partnerships that contribute to peace and stability and security, and things that all support prosperity. All those things that we have taken for granted for 70 years are now under threat. Now, specific to Korea and Japan, as I mentioned to the chairman, definitely engaged. There are arbitration mechanisms involved in their 1965 agreement and others that we encourage them both to use. And it's not worth picking sides or naming one is somehow at fault. The solution is to look forward, stop looking backwards, and to acknowledge the importance of their cooperation for their own security, their own prosperity, and for, certainly in the case of missile defense and all the others, the security of the U.S. and U.S. forces in Korea and Japan. And this is the message I've carried consistently, and hopefully they will resolve or begin the process.
Certainly that's the perspective of Congress. These are two close allies, two democratic free market nations that share relations and are strategically important to the United States. And obviously China, certainly the more friction there is, it just empowers China's ambitions in that region. Ms. Steele, thank you for your service as well. I know USAID's been looking at malaria in Southeast Asia, and I think there was a recent report suggesting that upwards to 65 million people in Southeast Asia are at risk of contracting malaria. Obviously, public health infrastructure, disease and detection isn't necessarily great in the rural parts of that country. In addition, there are reports of seeing some drug-resistant malaria. And just putting my doctor hat on, curious, what USAID's approach is to combating malaria in the region, and working with nations in the region to strengthen some of their public health infrastructure.
Thank you for that question, Congressman. In fact, resistance to current frontline medications for malaria has been a constant problem for us, and we are working very closely with WHO in trying to test different approaches. And I think I know we've been achieving some successes in Laos, for example. We have seen a 90% decrease in the cases, in malaria cases, and we would like to be able to scale that up in the other countries. So we're continually testing and doing surveillance to make sure that the further increase in malaria in the region does not continue.
Great, thank you. And shifting my line of questioning as well, one thing, when we think about the South China Sea and we think about maritime security in that region, Assistant Secretary Stillwell, we've seen the Filipinos government at times, kind of make overtures and positive statements towards China. We've now started to see them, say, well, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't such a great direction for us to go into, as China is, aggressively pushed into that maritime area. And obviously, there's disputes. If you could give us an update on, the latest on that region.
So thank you for that. In July, I took my first trip to the region, and the second stop was Manila. We conducted a bilateral security dialogue where exactly this topic was discussed at length. And, the good news is that, I guess security is sort of agnostic. The desire is to maintain access to EEZs, resources, oil exploration, all those things that a sovereign nation should enjoy in its near seas, territorial seas, and EEZs. This was discussed at length. I can get happy to follow up with the exact outcomes of that, but I will tell you that this dialogue, the Assistant Secretary of Defense Shriver and I, with our counterparts on the Philippine side, were in strong agreement on the way forward on the relationship. This is, on the one hand, you've got political signaling at the highest levels for public consumption, but it's rock solid where we were talking about the U.S. alliance and our cooperation with the Philippines, again, to protect common interests.
Great, thank you. I am out of time, so I will yield back.
Thank you. With the indulgence of my colleagues, I'm going to sneak in one question. Then I'm going to ask Mr. Barrow to take the chair, which he has promised to do until 4 o'clock or until the hearing is over. I think the hearing will end before 4 o'clock. He can then recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, who is a member of the subcommittee, and then the incredibly patient gentleman from Hawaii. The one question I have relates to, we have 100,000 Americans who have relatives in North Korea. Now, since the year 2000, there have been at least 21 family reunions involving residents of South Korea and North Korea. However, during that time, Korean Americans with relatives in the North have not had a single reunion. And of course, these individuals are entering into old age. Time is running out. As part of your negotiations with North Korea, what can the administration do to provide either of the two types of family reunification visits that the North has allowed, the video conference or hopefully the face-to-face? What can we do as time runs out?
Mr. Chairman, that's a really good idea, and I was not aware of that statistic. I'm going to defer to my colleagues, Special Representative Began, on that one, since he's pretty much intently focused.
You can't defer to him unless you have a face-to-face conversation with him and explain just how important this is.
Oh, and I see him all the time. I will make sure that we have
100,000 Americans, most of them elderly.
first heard.
So please do what you can. With that, the gentleman from the Sacramento area will take the chair.
And with that, I'll recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I know we've discussed about whether the U.S. is pulling back or asserting itself in this area. The FY20 budget is a little bigger than the 19, but it still cuts funding for global health programs, development assistance, and economic support fund. If we create a vacuum by not being there, China's going to move into it very rapidly. And China's influence is international. It goes far beyond its neighbors. I mean, they're building ports everywhere from Sri Lanka to Lima. But if you're in the neighborhood, in that sphere of influence, there's a great deal of pressure. And one of the countries that's there that I want to ask you about is Mongolia. I co-chair the Mongolian caucus with Representative Young, and I'm working with Representative Yoho on some legislation concerning the trade of cashmere. I'm also a member of the House Democracy Partnership, and Mongolia is a partner in that relationship. The DoD's Indo-Pacific strategy describes Mongolia as, and I quote, reliable, capable, and a natural partner of the U.S. We know Mongolia wants to strengthen ties with the U.S., and they've referred to us as a third neighbor. I wonder if you could talk to us about what you're doing specifically to help Mongolia diversify its economy, get on stronger footing. Can you describe the importance of the strategic partnership with Mongolia and how it affects our relationship as a so-called third neighbor?
Congresswoman, that's a great question, and I have to admit I haven't given a lot of thought to that specific aspect, but I do have a few things before I turn it over to Assistant Secretary Steele.
Thank
you. First off, the points you make reflect what we saw in the most recent trip of the need for economies to diversify. A lot of economies have depended on single resources, oil, coal, and those things, and they are going to need help. And this is where, like right now, or in November, we'll host the second Indo-Pacific Business Forum in Bangkok to point these things out, lay these out. There's lots and lots of capital out there looking for good investments. In Southeast Asia, Asia writ large, there's $27 trillion of infrastructure required, and there's still a lot of capital to go after investments that will bring returns. They have to be, and that's the difference between what we're doing and what what China's doing is, not necessarily so concerned about the economic viability of these things. So. I'll take that. I understand the Kashmir question, and I do think there's room to maneuver there. I will note that the budget, 47% increase in my area. I can't speak to the others. I do note that the priority of the Indo-Pacific is reflected in the budget, with a plus up of $3 million for the Mongolia. It sounds not like a lot, especially when you put it against One Belt One Road numbers, which are unfortunately inflated. That can get you a lot. But the thing I think we need to do most is engage and share ideas, and that I think will go a long way to get at what you're asking. But Gloria, if you want.
Thank you. When I was mission director in the Philippines, I was also mission director for Mongolia and the Pacific. And so I've spent some time in Mongolia. And one of the things that Assistant Secretary Stilwell said, $3 million is not enough, but it actually leverages funds from a certain bank that we helped to create, and that's the Haas Bank. It used to be a non-banking institution for macro enterprises, and that has become very, very successful, that it has become now one of the biggest banks in Mongolia. And when I was there, I had conversations with the president of Haas Bank so that we would help develop small and medium enterprises in order to diversify the economy beyond Kashmir and livestock. And the Haas Bank is prepared to provide the resources, capital, to support the small and medium enterprises that whose capacity we will be able to develop. We will be developing. It's been a successful program so far, and so I think leveraging our resources with that of the private sector is an important one, and we are doing that in spades in Mongolia. But in addition to this, we are also supporting the young leaders of Mongolia and exposing them to other leaders, youth leaders in other parts of Asia, so that they can exchange experiences, lessons learned, etc., especially in helping to promote openness and transparency in government. But the direct answer to your question is we're leveraging our $3 million with funds of a bank that the United States helped to create.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and so often when you diversify the economy, it's women who benefit because they do some of those small industry kind of business enterprises. And with students, and we ought to look at more exchanges with U.S. Universities, I believe. I know they were interested in tourism when I was over there, and I think about UNLV. I mean, we have the best hospitality school. Well, some people think maybe it's second or third, but I think it's the best. Those kinds of agreements. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And I'd like to recognize our colleague from the great state of Hawaii who's been incredibly patient. Mr. Case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do very much appreciate the Chair, Ranking Member, and Subcommittee members for allowing me to participate in your hearing today. Secretary Stilwell, aloha. It's great to have you here. Your experience as Director of the China Strategy Focus Group at Indo-PACOM and also as a adjunct fellow at the East-West Center, which is one of our critical outreach efforts into the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific region, is really valuable. So I'm glad to have you here. I want to focus just on the Pacific Islands themselves again for a second here. There are many issues that this subcommittee covers. We've covered many of them today. But if you take the actual Pacific Islands, who are mostly the islands sometimes referred to as Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, you will find that there are about 24 of them, 12 independent states and 12 territories, jurisdictions, freely associated states. But if you take the total area of those jurisdictions, including their EEZs, as you referenced, Mr. Secretary, the statistic actually is shocking that if you take all of that land area and add it up, it's more than the land area of Russia and China put together. So we're talking about a huge area of our world. And we're talking about the front lines, really, of the regional superpower competition that we have referenced in our national security documents. And I think we would both agree, perhaps, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but maybe I will, that this area has, in that context, been overlooked and needs a little bit of catch-up, including the soft power, if I can put it that way, Ms. Steele. And so I want to ask you, and this is renewed focus inside of Congress. We now have a Pacific Islands caucus focused just on those island jurisdictions here in Congress. First time ever that the chair and the ranking member and Mr. Young from Alaska and other members have joined together to try to give some attention to the Pacific Islands themselves, across the board, militarily, economically, socially, whatever is needed, climate change-wise. And so the question I want to ask is a very broad one, but we've got all of these programs. Some of them are new programs. We've got the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act. We've got the Infrastructure Transaction and Assistance Act. We've got the Maritime Security Initiative. We've got the new U.S. International Development Finance Corp. And then, as you said, Ms. Steele, we should focus on our existing programs, so USAID, Peace Corps. What's missing? I mean, I just get the sense that although this increased attention is there and the intention is there to focus, that we're still not where we need to be. I mean, is there a glaring omission here? Is it purely about more funding? Yes, we're all patting ourselves on the back about, more funding. That's great, but that's relative. It may have been way low, probably was way low for a decade plus. Should we just be ramping it up completely more on the funding side, or are there holes in our programs that we should be especially focusing on right now? Mr. Secretary, I want to take a shot, and then Ms. Steele, please.
Congressman, you make a great point, and I'll speak to the strategic aspects, and I'll let Mr. Secretary Steele talk to the larger questions about development and such. So, the sheer size of the region is daunting, and it's all water, and things that go in the water don't move very fast, and so getting in there, you have to get there. If you have to fly in there. Having flown into Micronesia, that runway is short. For the Pacific Islands Forum, we had to, get aircraft that could land on that runway at Tuvalu and all those. So there is a development aspect there, just simply in terms of infrastructure and transportation that will link them more closely with global economies and other things. There are other ways, I think, to get at the environmental issues as well. But I think at least in some ways, they just relate to getting there and being in the area. But, the thing, I got to sit next to President Heine on the way back from the meetings in Micronesia, and we discussed for a while sustainable development and what sorts of things that they can do to provide for their own people for the long term that is sustainable. And on the security side, one of those is defending your own resources in terms of EEZs, fisheries and such. And I do believe that's a place where we can cooperate. I'll be out in Indo-PACOM mid-October, and that'll be one of the topics we raise. Thank you.
Thank you. briefly. I'm out of time, not to mention I'm not on the subcommittee, so I can't take those liberties.
Thank you very much for the question. As I said, I was also mission director for the Pacific Islands while I was in the Philippines, and one glaring thing which we are going to be addressing is our presence. We are not present there physically. For example, we run our Pacific programs out of the Philippines. That's why I was the mission director. And there's a lot to be said about interactions with the people of the countries where we work. And we know that from all our bilateral programming. And so what we're going to be doing is assign people to countries in the Pacific so that we can work with them, interact with them, and help develop their capacity and transfer values that we have not been able to do by not being there. And I think this will amplify and expand the impact of the programs that we are having and we will be having as a result of our increased funding.
Thank you. I endorse that very much.
Thank you. And before I recognize Ms. Spanberger, Ms. Titus wanted to make a quick
Oh,
statement.
yeah, I just wanted to point out that Mr. Yoho is working with me on the, we're working together, rather, on the Mongolia issue and the diversification of the cashmere industry. I thought he had left, or I would have mentioned it earlier, but I just wanted to put that on the record. Thank you.
Great. Let me recognize our colleague from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In Central Virginia, farmers, small businesses, and consumers have borne tremendous financial strain due to the administration's ongoing trade war with China. And during a farm tour last month, I heard about the harmful long-term effects that these ill-advised trade actions have on Central Virginians, as we continue to hear stories about the challenges our local businesses have in identifying and maintaining strong international trading relationships. So my question is, during this moment of great economic uncertainty for some of our rural economies, small business owners and consumers, do you see any way in which this budget, or how does this budget strengthen potentially our trade relationships with other countries, and how might that impact some of our rural communities? I'm interested specifically in when we're looking at policies and budgets, how can we ensure that rural communities across the United States, such as the one I represent in Virginia, benefit from Asia's economic growth and strengthen our position in our trade negotiations ultimately with China?
When I have talked to American business people, one of their major complaints has been the lack of a level playing field. They're not able to compete openly and fairly because of corruption and lack of transparency. And one of the biggest goals of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to provide that kind of assistance to governments to review and reform their policies so that they can be more transparent, their procurements can be more transparent, and they can change their laws. We are working with ASEAN, for instance, to have one single window and to make it digital and transparent. And we are working with them and the U.S. in order to be able to have the U.S. be able to participate in this single window system that we have opened for the ASEAN. But in short, I think that one of the biggest constraints for us being able to invest and create more trade opportunities is the lack of a level playing field for our companies here in the U.S., and that's one of the areas that we are working with them on, working to make their procurements more transparent, changing their laws and policies on customs and trade, and making the trade laws more at par with international standards.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Assistant Secretary Stillwell, would you like to add anything? If not, I have another question. Thank you, sir. So I know there's been discussion already about the Rohingya and the Uyghurs, and I have a brief question. In 2017, over 1 million Rohingya fled persecution at the hands of the Myanmar military in what the United Nations fact-finding mission report is called genocide, crimes against humanity, and more. And today, the Rohingya live in the largest refugee settlement in the world in Bangladesh. Meanwhile, in the Xinjiang province of China, at least 1 million, but likely closer to 3 million Uyghur and other Muslim minorities are in detention camps. How do U.S. policies and budgets advance human rights in the region? And in what other tangible ways can the U.S. strengthen our commitment to promoting human rights, particularly in this region, recognizing the atrocities the Uyghurs and Rohingya have faced?
Congresswoman, as I've grown into this job, actually, it's been a while, as you wonder what it is that made the U.S., has gotten us where it is, it's been ideals and ideas and doing the right thing for the right reasons, vice doing things out of expedience. And a key part of that is recognizing the importance of human rights in all of this. The UN Charter specifies individual human rights that in many ways reflect our concerns and our interests in human rights. There are other countries who look at human rights in a different way and act in that way, in some cases dealing with minorities differently, minority groups differently than they treat the majority. And this relates mostly to the Xinjiang question. So one of the things we should do policy-wise is continue to emphasize the reason why we do that. There's a very positive and there's a very practical reason why you treat everybody the same, because that gets them all on board and that takes advantage of diverse ideas, and you have far less social strife when people feel like they can all contribute and be part of the larger group, vice being an outsider. And so, I think that part of what we do just by getting out and about and talking to people is demonstrating that. When we bring people here, we demonstrate that. One program that I got to see firsthand on this trip was the Young Southeast Asia Leaders Initiative. And a member from Burma actually participated in that VTC we did, video teleconference. And these are things that get at exactly what you're talking about. We cannot get in there and make individual governments do the right thing, but we can enable them and their constituents to understand the power and the reasons why we do it this way. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And let me recognize our colleague from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you can see the Virginian interest in this topic. And first of all, I don't know what power you have to recommend Mr. Stilwell, but Ms. Steele is my constituent. She deserves a promotion and a big fat raise. And what you just said, I think was an eloquent statement from a representative of our State Department about who we are and what has distinguished us. We're not always successful, and that doesn't mean there aren't times we don't descend to a level of compromise that frankly sullies our good name and those ideals. But the fact of the matter is we hold them up to ourselves. And I give a lot of speeches to citizens, to new citizens as they're being sworn in. And I always talk about that. It's not our race, it's not our ethnic background, it's not some religious cohesion. It's a set of ideas and ideals that make you an American. And that sets us apart. That is what out of many becomes one. And so I thank you for what you just said, because we need right now as a government to be repeating that in other places around the world. They need to hear us repeat it, because there are some doubts about whether we are still committed, and it's very refreshing to have you say what you said, so thank you. I got two questions. One is, with respect to the Rohingya, we've got the Myanmar military and government basically destroying their homelands and their villages so that there's nothing to return to. And meanwhile, the welcome mat in Bangladesh in huge refugee settlements seems to be wearing thin. And I am very worried, well, what happens? We don't want to condemn people to return to Myanmar and face persecution or worse. And on the other hand, we don't want them suffering inhumane conditions in a host country that's poor to begin with, very poor. Your comment, Mr. Assistant Secretary Stilwell.
Congressman, thank you for that. First overall comment was, right now we tend to look at this problem in two lobes. One is, they go to Bangladesh or they go to Burma. I think, obviously, it has to be more sophisticated than that. Would also note that the U.S. with the administration and the Congress have allocated more than $542 million to help address this issue. So it's not like we're not engaged. We're actually doing a lot to help out. We've sanctioned through the JADE Act and through other things, not just the members, but the families of the members.
No, Ms. Stilwell, I think maybe I didn't phrase the question. I'm not in any way, even inferentially, necessarily focusing on us and criticism of our response. Right. I'm worried about the here and now. They're between the rock and the hard place right now, and there are 750,000 of them in Bangladesh. So what happens? What's your sense of a solution to that growing dilemma?
In the end, incentivizing both governments to find a solution that benefits, and getting and growing world attention to this, and regional support and pressure, vice making it like our problem, or we need to get everybody involved to contribute to a solution.
Ms. Steele?
I think we cannot give up on this problem. It is a very difficult one. We will continue to work with other like-minded donors, both in Bangladesh and in Burma, to keep putting pressure on the government of Burma to treat the Rohingya better. And to respect their human rights. In the meantime, in the short term, we are providing humanitarian assistance. We are working in Burma with other donors to provide access to education, health, and livelihood. That is really a temporary thing. We do not want to make this a long-time effort, but that is what we have right now, is the short-term solution to keep them alive, and then the medium term, which is continue to put pressure on the governments of both countries, on Bangladesh to keep them there and give them access, the same kind of access that we would want to see for their other populations. So I think it's just continuing the pressure to do good, to do the right thing by the Rohingya, and working with other donors to amplify the pressure on them.
Well, it time's out. I mean, all of that's nice, but I think we're facing an impending crisis that is dire, and I don't want to see Bangladesh feel that it has to push them back to an untenable situation where they face genocide. But we have to recognize the dire poverty of Bangladesh and their ability, frankly, to sustain 750,000 refugees. So let's work together. But I mean, I think we have to find some bold solutions here that go beyond pressing and hoping and a little bit more aid. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Porter of California has asked to participate in this hearing without objection, and we'll recognize Ms. Porter of California.
Thank you to Chairman Sherman and Ranking Member Yoho and all of the committee members for allowing me to join this hearing. Assistant Secretary Stilwell, as you are likely aware, one of my constituents, Michael Nguyen, an American citizen from Orange County, has been held in prison in Vietnam for over 14 months. Michael is a loving father. He is an American citizen who was charged and convicted of plotting against the Vietnamese government. He was held for almost 8 months without formal charges. His trial this summer lasted only about 4 hours before he was sentenced to 12 years in jail, and that is not justice. Michael's absence is devastating his family. He has a wife and 4 young daughters. They haven't seen or spoken to him since he was detained over a year ago, and they do not know when they will see him again. His family has shared stories with me and with all of this committee about their suffering. His wife is now basically a single mom, working 60 to 80 hours a week as a surgical nurse to try to get by. His kids have trouble sleeping and doing their homework, and 12 years must seem like an eternity to them to wait for his return. Michael's family continues to advocate for his release. In fact, Helen Nguyen, Michael's wife, testified in front of this committee in July, and I am grateful for the strong support that they continue to receive from this committee and from my colleagues in Congress on both sides of the aisle. We are united in our efforts to protect and support Americans abroad. I want to thank your team at the Department of State for consistently raising concerns about Michael's case and for supporting Michael's family. Will you give me your commitment that the State Department will continue to advocate for Michael and continue to raise concerns about the fair treatment of U.S. citizens in Vietnam?
Absolutely, and I'm in touch with the ambassador on this subject as well.
How does the treatment of U.S. citizens affect the U.S. strategy in the region?
A key role of the strategy is governance, and it has to do with human rights, has to do with transparency, it has to do with rule of law. This is a new addition. This is not something that we used to talk about when we talked about regional strategy. And with that, we, as part of the strategy, when we engage, in individual countries, we demonstrate not only our wish that they would follow suit, but the practicality and the reasons why you would do that to benefit, yourself and your population. So I think that's the best we can do right now is to, model the behavior that we would like others to see.
Thank you very much. I really would appreciate if you would continue to work with your team to advocate for Michael's release. And I know his family and our community in Orange County would really like to see him return as quickly and as safely as possible. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Seeing no other folks with questions, I thought I would make a quick closing statement and also give Mr. Yoho that opportunity as well. First has been my habit, both Assistant Secretary Stilwell and Assistant Secretary Steele. I do want to commend the work of our diplomats and development agents, both around the world and here domestically. And I don't think we recognize the importance of the work that they do. And again, want to make sure that they understand that this Congress certainly appreciates the work that they do and how hard they represent the United States around the world. In addition, there were comments made. If we think about United States leadership globally in the post-World War II era and the 70 years post-World War II, it was pretty remarkable what we accomplished, and we shouldn't make light of that, particularly as we think about rebuilding the East Asia region, stepping up to protect democracy on the Korean Peninsula. And if you think about the Republic of Korea, where it was 40 years ago and where it is today, that is in no small part because of American involvement, American leadership, rebuilding Japan post-World War II. Yes, we created competitors, but we also created vibrant trading partners, stable democracies, and stable allies. And I don't think we're not a perfect nation, but the world is a better place, and that region is a better place because of United States involvement, American leadership, and American diplomacy and development. And as we think about the next 7 years, it will be a different world. But the world needs American leadership and American diplomacy and American aid and development. And as we move forward, that shouldn't be a Democratic or a Republican ideal, because if we're not there, and this committee identifies, there are other countries that may not have the same benevolent desire to create a world that is much more interrelated, that's based on those principles and values that our country is based on. So, again, part of the reason why I love this committee is historically we have operated in a somewhat bipartisan way when we're thinking about how we make this world a better place. So again, thank you for your service. Thank you for the service of the people that work for you, and both in USAID and Department of State. And again, let's go on and make the next 70 years a much better place as well. Ted, yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I appreciate sitting with you too. You guys are great for accessibility and I hope you feel our office is that way in this committee. You brought up Mongolia, and we can expand beyond Kashmir, absolutely. The Third Neighbor Trade Act, the Mongolian Third Neighbor Trade Act, to be able to create 50,000 jobs in a country, to expand their economy, to diversify that economy at a cost of less than $1 million to the U.S. taxpayers over a 10-year period, and it's only a 5-year bill. This is something that we can do, and we had a group of Mongolian representatives in today, and Kashmir people, producers, and they were saying that, if we can get some money just to update our mills, we can do the weaving and all that and the spinning right here, and that's something going through that bank, and so we're going to send them your direction. And then with ASEAN, you and I have talked extensively about ASEAN and the aggression of China that we're seeing. The conduct of the sea agreement that's coming up, law of the sea, for ASEAN to stand up now is so imperative that they stand up and not let China encroach on the EEZs of the Philippines, of Vietnam, of Brunei, or any of these other countries, because if they allow that to happen, there is no turning back. And this is something that they have to come together. And, I know we've talked about it's not just them. It'll be the United States, it'll be Canada, it'll be the UK, Germany, France, South Korea, Japan, Australia, all these nations will stand up. And this is something that if we are going to have a prosperous 70 years from now without major conflicts, we have to have rule of law. And we hear over and over again, ASEAN says the reason it's so successful is because rule of law. And then you have to have countries that will follow those rules. So I thank you for being here, and I'm proud of the work you do, and just keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.